Temperate forests, some of the most widespread and economically important forests on the planet. Um, these forests are distinguished from tropical forests by having a distinct winter. Um, However, they also support broadleaf species. That implies two things. They're not so cold that broadleaf species cannot persist there. So we're talking about again, a transition from tropical forests up towards the poles, but not too close to the poles. These forests can be dominated by broadleaf species, but they are often not. They are often dominated by conifers. We're going to return to the factors that control that in a little bit. But first, let's talk about a few characteristics that unite all temperate forests. They generally have a long growing season, 4 to 6 months, even in Maine, where I used to live, and where it was cold. Within these forests, an even distribution tends to favor broadleaf species, but when you have winter rains, that tends to favor conifers. Again, I'm going to come back to some examples of this, but let's just talk about one particular forest type because I think it's the most familiar to you, and that's the Mediterranean type forests. These tend to be broad-leaved, sclerophyllous forests. That word is a mouthful. And what it means is having thick, leathery, and tough foliage. The foliage is built to last through a difficult, hot and dry summer. The Mediterranean climate, precipitation is predominantly in the winter. All the significant precipitation is in the winter. We have this long annual drought. These can be hot climates. San Luis Obispo is much more coastal. That's moderated by the coast, but just go a little bit inland and it can be hot. Similarly, the south of Portugal, interior Spain, much of Australia and South Africa, where these forest types also occur, they range from degrees of discomfort in terms of heat. Frosts are rare here, but they do occur, and they can be important for structuring these forests. And they range from being evergreen, whether they're broadleaved or conifers, dominated by broadleaf trees or conifers, or they can be drought deciduous. And you may know California buckeye or California or blue oak, which are drought deciduous species. They lose their leaves to avoid the stresses of drought. Despite how familiar this forest type may be to you, especially if you're from coastal California, it reflects a relatively small part of the globe's global forest types, but they also have sort of an outsized importance in terms of biodiversity and economic importance because lots of people live within them. So the entire Mediterranean basin, which is where the forest type gets its name, these also occur in the west coast of South America, the southern tip of Africa, and Australia, in addition to California. And these these places in the world all share some common characteristics in that they have associated with cold ocean currents, which create this seasonal pattern of drought and winter precipitation. I've shown this photograph before from the south of Portugal. It's just to I think that I could get away with lying to you and saying that I took this behind the Cal Poly campus or someplace nearby, maybe on Cuesta Ridge or something. It's not. It's from the south of Portugal. The species have many of the same characteristics for dealing with drought, occasional frost, and heat that they would behind Cal Poly. And that's why I kind of try to make that joke. But as one goes to different parts of California, you will see variation. Many different oaks and so forth that are more dominant in different parts of California. The environment is wide-ranging despite this general pattern of a hot, dry summer and a cool, wet winter. Here's an example from Lake County, and there are many different adaptations here that are, again, all part of dealing with this very peculiar climate. And I say peculiar because if you've lived anywhere else, it usually rains in some other part of the year. And the only whenever it rains in the summer here, which does happen occasionally, you should really hold your breath because it's probably when you're going to have dry lightning storm. So just like happened in the summer of 2020. Anyway, so next, well, let's deal with this problem of conifers versus broadleaf.